So, hi, welcome to another presentation by the Political Theory SRC. Today is Esther's turn to present on the topic Plato and Rhetoric. Esther, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Right, so maybe I'll just explain the background to like why I started on this project. I think if you have any background in philosophy or political theory, you will inevitably come into contact with Plato. And the difficult thing with Plato is that when you try to explain to people what Plato actually talks about, or if a friend asks you like, oh, what did you discuss in class? Sometimes it's pretty hard to explain to people how all like his philosophy works. And I think especially when you move beyond the Republic or like the more metaphorical stuff, you have like I think in the Statesman or in the Sophists, you have things like, oh, being is becoming, or like I think like a lot of like very complicated like metaphysical concepts. And I think the question that I had is, Plato places a lot of emphasis on philosophy and like using philosophy to guide our lives. But if we have such a hard time um, learning about philosophy, and not just learning about philosophy, but communicating it, um, how are we supposed to get people to embrace philosophy and to use philosophy to lead their lives? So that was a question I had. And I think the other part about this project is this whole idea of rhetoric and this really bad image that it has right now. I think I'll discuss it a little bit more later, but when we talk about rhetoric, it's always about how it is superficial. It plays on emotions rather than logic. Um, and just like in general, it's a synonym for speech that is bad. Uh, and so, what is Plato's thought on rhetoric? That is kind of like my focus for this paper. And I think my thesis is that while it is easy to kind of like dismiss rhetoric, and you might even see Plato as doing such, I argue that rhetoric and persuasion are actually indispensable to a philosophical and a political life. And this this tension lies on the fact that when we think of rhetoric, we usually think of a pretty like rhetoric of the sophists, like sophistic rhetoric. But if we look to Plato, and especially if we look to the Phaedrus, we'll see that Plato actually prescribes a different kind of rhetoric, a rhetoric that we might call soul-directed rhetoric, that is actually indispensable to a philosopher who wants to do things in the political realm. Yeah. So the first thing, what is rhetoric? Yeah, again, if we look to the modern day perception of rhetoric, it's that the reigning view of rhetorical speech is that it is a disruptive force. It is a threat to democratic deliberation. It is superficial. It is deceptive. These are all the modern day criticisms of rhetoric. And oh yeah, just to mention it, my presentation focuses a lot on Gorgias and Phaedrus, which is the two most obvious discussions of rhetoric in Plato's works. So the first one, the negatives, you'll see that in particular, the Gorgias has a very negative impression of rhetoric. It heavily criticizes it. In comparison, Phaedrus is the one that kind of like talks about where Plato is a bit more generous with in his opinions about rhetoric. Yeah, and so Gorgias, to give just like a little background, what happens in the Gorgias is that Plato is talking to a few people who are kind of like who can be considered Sophists, and the main question that he asks them is like, oh, what is your craft? What do you do? What do you call yourself? And then the discussion leads to kind of a full-on like fight between Plato and these like characters in terms of like whether rhetoric is an art or is a knack, and then like things about like whether knowing the truth is necessary, so on and so forth. So for the negatives of rhetoric, it comes out most clearly in Gorgias. He says first at the beginning of the dialogue that it is clear to me, especially from what he has said, that Polus has devoted himself more to what is called oratory than to discussion. And this is where he clearly makes a distinction between what we would typically think of rhetoric and what we might think of philosophical discussion or debate. And then he goes on to say that oratory is not a craft, but a knack, because it has no account of the nature of everything it applies, by which it applies them. In other words, it means that an orator, in making his speeches about justice or truth, he does not actually know what they are, and he cannot give a full account of each thing, but only aims at persuading their audience. And how they do that is by producing a certain gratification and pleasure in these audiences. So the task for the orator is simply to know what the audience likes, and to make their speech in a way such that it plays on those desires or preferences. And you might think of like modern day populist rhetoric as something similar. And so in comparison, there's this comparison between pleasure and truth, and Socrates makes clear later that truth is not always pleasing to people, and when we aim only at pleasure, then anywhere near the truth. This is a good summary of the criticism of rhetoric. It doesn't need to have any knowledge of the state of their subject matters. It only needs to have discovered some device to produce persuasion, which is, their preferences, their desires. And then the key thing is that they make themselves appear to those who don't have knowledge that they know more than those who actually do have it. So there's this like extended example that the Sophists gives, that he and his brother, who is a doctor, in talking to a patient, when a patient doesn't want to take his medicine, when he doesn't want to accept treatment, when the doctor is not able to convince this patient, um, the orator is able to, and that is kind of like um, what they think makes them superior to other uh, people, yeah, to other crafts. Okay. But why might we think that this picture of rhetoric is overly simplistic or is overly negative? I think the important thing to notice here is that Plato himself uses rhetoric, and he uses he tries to persuade people most of the time himself too. Yeah. And so that might make us question, like, wait, so what is this whole problem with persuasion? What is this whole problem with rhetoric? Is Plato contradicting himself here, in criticizing it and then using it himself? Or is there something deeper that we might be able to decipher? Yes. So Plato's own practice of rhetoric, you will see most clearly, first and foremost, in his own writings. For example, we might ask, why did Plato choose to write in the form of like dialogues, like in the form of a narrative with characters, um, um, with this whole setup, like a background. Socrates meets certain characters, they get into an argument or a debate, and then there's some sort of like climax, and then there's a conclusion. It follows the structure of a narrative, as compared to like a treatise, which you might find like maxims or principles just listed one by one, as to, this is what nature is, this is what justice is. So his choice to use dialogues is a pretty telling one, I think. And I think Eunice also suggests that his choice of topics, and the way he communicates the debate on these topics, suggests that his material is aimed at non-philosophical readers. And so if I think, I would say that not all his works are like that, but if like anyone just picks up the Republic and reads like the allegory of the cave, that is definitely more accessible, compared to maybe a treatise on the nature of justice, on its own. Yeah. And so this choice in framing his own work, and in how he communicates his own thoughts, indicates his preference towards rhetoric, rather than just like strictly like philosophical, like dialectic style kind of writing. And so his own writings is indicator. And then the next thing is that, if you really think about it, it's not just rhetoric that persuades. Philosophy also persuades, and philosophy also aims at persuasion. So generally speaking, to have a normative theory about ethics, obviously it's aimed at kind of like telling people what should be the case, what people should do, um, and it aims at persuading people um, to live in a certain way as compared to all these other alternatives. Um, so um, I think if we look at how Gorgias proceeds, it becomes clear that Socrates and his interlocutors cannot sustain a distinction between truth and rhetoric. Um, and yeah, argument also persuades, and um, to define oratory or rhetoric as the producer of persuasion, that's just uh, too broad. It also encapsulates philosophy. And then the next best thing is to say that there's a difference between good rhetoric and bad rhetoric. But as we will see later in the presentation, this distinction is also not all that satisfactory. Yeah. And um, and if we see philosophy as also persuading, we also see Plato himself using all sorts of rhetorical tricks kind of, to also aim at persuasion. And just to list a few, the most obvious throughout would be flattery. Plato often the a dialogue starts with Plato meeting a person, and then Plato asking, not Plato, Socrates through Plato asking the character, for example, like what is justice? Um, in the Gorgias, it's what is your craft? What do you call your craft? What do you do? How do you define oratory? In Republic, he asks like a series of different people, what is justice? How do you define justice? And often he starts out by um, stroking their egos, kind of like, oh, you are wiser than me, you know this better than me, so teach. Um, um, there's a lot of like, especially if the dialogue proceeds and Plato's Socrates starts to kind of show that there are contradictions in what these characters suggest, uh, you'll see that, you'll see that these characters kind of get frustrated, or they get angry at Plato, at Socrates. Sorry, I keep saying Plato. They keep getting angry at Socrates, but then Socrates will say something like, "Oh, you are do not give up now, for uh, like um, um, you are wiser, and you are able to, I'm sure that you're able to tell me what justice actually is." um, and this whole like practice uh, helps to get that those characters into the conversation, to say that, oh, you're so smart, you tell me what justice is. It gets them into the conversation. It also keeps the conversation going. um, and then in some dialogues, most particularly I think in Phaedrus, um, when Socrates is trying to persuade uh, Phaedrus to share a speech that he heard, um, there's a lot of like push and pull, like, and then I think um, he says things like, "Oh, don't be coy. Share with me this speech." Um, there is a like semi seduction like kind of going on, and in the same way as flattery and like stroking of egos, is to kind of like get their attention, is to get them to cooperate, to participate in this conversation about what, um, about like this like philosophical topics. um, and you see sometimes in the dialogues themselves, they use all sorts of emotional or figurative language, In particular, I think there are 12 or 14 distinct Platonic myths uh, um, created by Plato himself, um, um, usually right before or right after like a whole like philosophical discussion. He uses a myth to kind of illustrate what he's trying to talk about, as an analogy or whatever. And this pulls on our intuition, and our emotions rather than logic. Because if you look at those myths themselves, they might not be as rigorous or as airtight as one might expect in a philosophical discussion. But Plato still uses them in his dialogues, because they uh, um, help us learn what he's talking about in a different way. So in this way, we see that even though there is this huge criticism towards rhetoric, and how it aims at persuasion, um, Plato himself uses a lot of rhetorical tricks. His works are framed in a rhetorical way. He obviously himself also aims at persuasion. So now we see like this sort of tension going on. So the way that Plato resolves or reconciles this tension is to appeal to the true art of rhetoric. And if you recall before, um, he says in Gorgias that rhetoric is not an art, it's not a craft, it is a knack. But here, when we go into Phaedrus, he actually prescribes what he calls like a true art of rhetoric, um, which he defines as like a soul leading rhetoric. Yes. And so the main argument here is that any discourse, any rhetoric, or any exchange prompted by the love of wisdom, um, and aiming at converting the hearer to a philosophical life would be true rhetoric. Um, and when he talks about psychagogia, or like this part of soul leading, he means it as he says he only uses it in two specific instances, and it's both towards rhetoric. He says rhetorical art is a way of directing the soul by means of speech, and then later the nature of speech is in fact to direct the soul. So to bring in this element, like going beyond persuasion, but to direct the soul, and especially to direct the soul towards philosophy, that is what distinguishes true rhetoric from the sophistic rhetoric that we were talking about earlier. Yeah. Yeah. So in Phaedrus, he says, I think before Phaedrus himself, who's a character in the Phaedrus, he says, it is not necessary for the intending orator to learn what is really just, but only what will seem just to crowd who will act as the judge. Nor again what is really good or noble, but only what will seem so, for that is what persuasion proceeds from, not truth. So, and then Socrates suggests that rhetorical art, taken as a whole, is a way of directing the soul by means of speech, not only in courts and on public occasions, but also in private. So whenever there is an exchange like prompted by a love for wisdom, and if it's aiming towards converting people to a philosophical life, no matter where it happens, whether in the law courts or in private, that is what rhetoric is. And so this is a clear distinction between what Phaedrus says, like what seems right to the crowd, uh, compared to this. Yeah. And so the three conditions that we can kind of see in Phaedrus as to what makes for a true art of rhetoric is first, I think we said this earlier, it must aim at virtue. It must aim at converting the hearer to philosophy. It aims at what is best rather than what is pleasurable. If we recall the definition of rhetoric, as a producer of pleasure and gratification. This is where Socrates says, "Oh no, true rhetoric is one that directs the soul and aims at virtue, aims at philosophy." While the second one is, of course, that the person who engages, or the person who initiates the conversation and the discourse, must know the subject matter. So in comparison to sophistic rhetoric, where the orator doesn't need to know what is actually justice, what is actually good, or what is actually bad, Plato here says that the rhetorician must indeed know what justice or injustice is, or any other moral qualities, and so they must know the subject matter. And how do they know the subject matter? That is through philosophy, and this is where it goes back to the very like nitty-gritty, very philosophical method of the dialectics. You will see in Phaedrus, or in any other, in a couple other dialogues, where Plato talks about the method of collection and division, and that is his clearest explication of what the philosophical method might be, and that is what the orator must first go through. So they, through philosophy and through the philosophical method, must know what they're talking about, and then they bring it into rhetoric and into their speeches. And then the last one is that they must know their audience, and they must tailor their speech to suit their audience. And this brings into play like an interesting element in Plato's works. He seems to think that there were a few different types of souls, and that each soul was more suited to different kinds of pursuits. And obviously only a few, only like a minority of souls were naturally inclined to philosophy. And so these would be people who would be able to think about philosophy, or want to do philosophy on their own. For the rest of them, they're not naturally inclined to philosophy. They might be more attracted to certain pleasures, or Phaedrus himself, for example, he is attracted to rhetoric and rhetorical speeches for their aesthetic beauty, instead of like any truth or any philosophy behind those speeches. And so that is a different kind of soul that Plato's concerned with too. And so there are all different types of souls. but for like Plato seems to think that that as many people um, uh, as many people getting to know philosophy and converting to a life of philosophy is best for the city. And so the problem the problem would be trying to convince them that philosophy is good, even if they are not naturally inclined to philosophy. So this is where speech comes in. This is where rhetoric comes in. So the philosopher who knows the nature of justice or the nature of freedom um, philosophically, he has to find a way to translate that into something accessible even to the non-philosophical person. And so what we're getting at here is that this like true art of rhetoric, if it fulfills like these three conditions, would be able to do that. And so yeah, I think this is the point to talk about like what prompted Plato's whole discussion on rhetoric and philosophy. And so the first thing is that he thought that the philosopher had a duty to lead non-philosophical people. So since philosophy helps you lead a virtuous life, people should do philosophy. But since only the philosopher is good at doing philosophy, the philosopher should should rule over these like citizens so that they lead like a philosophically driven life. And if you look at the allegory of the cave, he seems to think that the person who ascended out of the cave and who looked into the sun and the forms themselves should go back into the cave to try to lead the other prisoners out of the cave too. And so that is the duty of the philosopher. And so like going back to this whole impetus of like true rhetoric, it is simply to help all citizens, whether or not they are naturally philosophically inclined, to help all of them lead a life of philosophy, or lead a life that is guided by philosophy. Yeah, and so yeah, and if you compare it to the Republic, Plato there has a whole discussion on how to order the society or the ideal like polis, so that all like the citizens lead a virtuous life. And you will notice that this is a extremely difficult task. He basically concludes that the ideal polis has to start from scratch, kind of like brainwashing them, with a noble lie, with a noble myth about like the origins of the city, or like how different types of people came to be, and how and that is how he would institute the philosopher king as the ruler of the city. And then there's this whole like very long discussion on the education system, or the entire like social structure needed to bring up these like potential philosopher kings. There's a whole ton of like many years of education, they have to live separate from other people. Um, I mean, it's definitely a whole task on its own. It doesn't seem that realistic. It doesn't seem that attainable, and so um, we might think of like the philosophical rhetoric as providing an alternative for the city to in general kind of like lead a virtuous life, or how the philosopher would convince other people, like other citizens, to embrace philosophy. Um, yeah, so that's a good like point to think about. And if we like um, if we look to other parts of Plato's dialogues, we might see like small examples here and there of how that might work out, in how like this like rhetoric, philosophical rhetoric might work out in real life. And the I think a good example would be in the laws, um, and the use of preludes um, before prescribing a certain law. So let me see if I can find that part. Right. So um, we in the laws there we see like, okay, there are two approaches to law giving. So this the first one would be an undiluted, a very dictatorial prescription of law. So like, you can do this, you cannot do this, blah blah blah. But then there's a second one, a more gentle approach, in which uh, we they will be trying to persuade citizens to avoid like certain activities, not because they will be punished if they don't, which is the first kind of approach, but because they know themselves that they are inherently undesirable. So um, I instead of saying like, oh, you cannot litter because there will be a fine if you litter. Um, the second approach kind of says something like, oh, you cannot litter because littering harms the environment. Littering is aesthetically displeasing. Littering is an inconvenience to your neighbors. So we see like these two approaches to law giving, and um, um, in like what Plato would suggest is that um, to use the second approach, the gentler approach, we might appeal to something like the preludes. So the preludes would come before the actual law, and they would kind of like describe, yeah, as I said before, like why is it undesirable, why you should do certain things or why you shouldn't do certain things. Um, and and this quote here sums it up pretty well. Like, they do not prescribe. They don't tell you like, oh, don't do this or do that. But if successful, they put people in a favorable state of mind, more apt, more open to learning, and then and so makes them more amenable to accepting legal prescriptions that they are coupled with. Um, and so we might think of this as an example of like how rhetoric might be used in political life, um, attached to some sort of like prescription, and putting them in a state where they are open to thinking about, why this thing is bad, why this thing is good, and generally to make the decision on their own, philosophically, on how they should act, rather than just just like, you know, under the threat of punishment to do or not do something. Yeah. So I think this gives a good summary of what my paper was about. Again, my argument is that while it is easy to dismiss rhetoric, if we actually look deeper into Plato, beyond Gorgias, we might see that rhetoric and persuasion are necessary to philosophical life. Any philosopher that wants to teach people philosophy or wants to lead people to philosophy would have to use rhetoric or use persuasion. And so if we look beyond Gorgias and we look at Phaedrus, we might see that Plato prescribes a true art of rhetoric that distinguishes it from the rhetoric that we typically think of today. And this has, implications for how we might think of rhetoric today, and how we might kind of like wrestle with this whole problem of like populism and like the role of persuasion in politics. Yeah. So this has been my presentation. I am happy to take any questions. I have a cat.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really interesting. I do have a few points and questions, but maybe Lisa wants to go first. Or I can like start with a warm-up question. He focused a bit on the allegory of the cave and what it takes to make the ideal polis from scratch. And we all know the concept about the really educated philosopher king who needs to go through like a lot of years of education, and that has always bugged me a bit in the concept, in the general framework of Plato, because he also says that only this minority can become enlightened and rule the city and deserve it, and only, as you said, only a few souls are naturally inclined to philosophy. But with the sole exception of Socrates, every other man in the circle of Plato was rich. So philosophy and rhetoric were the hobbies of the rich people. Who, I don't know if they were naturally inclined to philosophy, but they definitely had the means and the time to afford having such a hobby. It was even in their names. Plato's actual name, if I'm not mistaken, was Aristocles, coming from the word ariston, which means excellent in Greek. And that was a pattern in ancient Greece with the names. So in relation to the art of persuasion and how it is necessary to teach rhetoric, how would you describe this connection between building the ideal polis when it was essentially a rich man fun club that had this conversation?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think if we look to Aristotle as well, there's this whole justification for it, is so that the free man could have the time to think about virtue and to pursue virtue. And there definitely was a whole like status and a class thing attached to the learning of philosophy and learning, I guess, in general. Yeah, so there definitely is a difficult and a confounding factor, I think, here as to how this ideal polis would be formed. I mean, obviously, I don't think that Plato provides so much as like a blueprint for how um, of how the city should be ordered. I think right now what we know about intersectionality, or about like diversity and like the importance of diverse views for um, um, like even for like epistemic purposes, um, in like a deliberative democracy. All of these things are important, and the fact that in Plato's world or in Aristotle's world, it is likely that only the rich would be able to do what he suggested. Um, that is definitely something that we would not um, accept today. Um, um, so in structuring this ideal polis, um, I guess my first point would be that rhetoric kind of provides an alternative to like this, like having to like build this like ideal polis so that people lead virtuous life, um, to this like kind of like almost like in a smaller scale of like the philosopher going around to almost like a missionary to convert people to philosophy. Yeah, and like all this like small scale ways that that uh slowly guides people, like even non-philosophical people, towards philosophy. um yeah, and I think secondly, uh, this whole idea of rhetoric and the ideal city, if we kind of bring it to the present day, then there would be a lot more discussion on on exactly like what do we mean when we talk about philosophy, and what do we mean when we say like we want a life guided by philosophy. Um, um, yeah, so I think not a very satisfying answer, and I think partially I would blame it on Plato himself for kind of like pretty like uh, elitist like framework, I guess.
He was a man of his era, let's just say.
I guess, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
The second question that I have is, I would really like to know your opinion and your personal approach on Gorgias. I'm not sure how to pronounce all of these things in English because I learned them in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that. He was more of a sophist than a philosopher or anything else, and sophists were known for charging fees for their skills and for being teachers who taught like virtue and excellence to whoever could afford them, who were young statesmen and nobles of the
Right.
time. So when I haven't read Plato in a while, but while reading Gorgias, you do get the dissatisfaction between Socrates and Gorgias when they interact with each other, and the insults going back and forth of, oh, I'm a rhetor, and what I do is I kind of try to enlighten people, but you're a sophist, so you just teach them how to say certain things and get their point across and essentially win elections, kind of.
Yes.
So on the conditions for the rhetoric, you said that they should aim at virtue, which is something that the sophists said they were teaching. to the young
Right.
pupils.
Yes.
And the
Yeah.
second is that they should know the subject matter. And here we have which is like the quality, immoral qualities and the truth, which is where Socrates comes into play by saying that, I only know one thing, that I know nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you first assess the whole Gorgia situation with him like being paid to teach virtue in relation
Right.
to the conditions that he presented?
I mean, Socrates himself takes pride in not accepting fees for speaking, or for teaching. Um, I think he says this in the Apology. In like generally, he in his own defense, that he never accepted fees. He was unlike the Sophists, in that he didn't pretend to know uh, what he didn't know. So like going back to the few conditions, um, I think Socrates or Plato would be clear that like virtue should not be kind of like gate like there's no gatekeeping involved in towards virtue. It's not that you only those who pay a fee can hear like what virtue is. The second thing is that Plato was clear that the Sophists did not know what they were talking about. Um, and in that sense, he framed Socrates in saying that, I only know that I do not know, as as better or as more knowledgeable than the Sophists. And I think that is how like this whole part of like ignorance, or like knowing that you do not know is a huge part of how we characterize Socrates, or Plato. But as we go further into the later dialogues, then you see more of like Plato actually trying to formulate definitions, trying to come to an understanding of what, for example, like he says, oh, he like there's this whole division of like, oh, what is a statesman, what is a sophist. um so like I think like he doesn't just stop at like, okay, I actually realize like philosophy tells me that I am actually not as I think I am. That's the first stage. But once I get to this point of like this like humbling as well, um, then we can move towards an actual like philosophical like process of coming to know what these concepts or what these like important things are. Yeah, and I think like especially like moving towards the later dialogues, he does try to 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 like make a definition, or like actually prescribe what he thinks certain things are. Yeah. So I think um it's not, I think it's, yeah, both are definitely important, but they don't like preclude one another. And I think he definitely does see himself as being able to um to come to know what the subject matter is. Yeah.
And one last
Yes.
question that is
Cool.
kind of broadly related. If you had to recommend only one of Plato's texts that you read, which one would
Okay.
it be?
Of all the texts,
Of the ones you have read, out of the
oh
chapters you've read?
like my favorite.
Yeah.
um I mean, I definitely have a non-favorite, and that would be the Statesman.
Fair enough.
statesman and sophist together, I will never want to read them again. I actually did quite like Phaedrus. I think it's a good balance. Like Phaedrus starts out with 3 like what we would normally call like rhetorical like speech. The whole thing with Phaedrus sharing the speech of Lysias, Plato's own speech on the lover boy, and then like this whole like palinode in which he kind of like recants his previous speech and says like, oh, what actually the what love actually is. But then he also goes into like this whole like method of collection and division, and then into talking about the nature of speech. And so I think it's a good mix of both like what we would call like maybe a bit more like accessible like rhetorical part of like the dialogues. They're definitely a bit more accessible, and then the more like philosophical stuff. Yeah, I think Amino is probably a good like runner up. Yeah, but I think I'm much clearer on what I don't like than what I like. Yeah.
These were all of my questions.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we are almost out of time. Oh, we're out of time.
Okay. I don't think there is anything else. So thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.